Thank you all very much. As I was sitting up there before Joe got up, I realized that everybody had an introductory function. Everybody had somebody to introduce except me. I'm the last one on the stage, so I wanted to take this opportunity to officially introduce my mother, Joel Rhoads, who has come with me. Actually, I take her with me whenever I go out for speeches. She's sort of my prop, okay, when I take her with me. And I love her to death, and she's been with me every step of the way, as you will hear. I've been invited to come down to share my story, and I know some of you have heard the story, and I hate to tell you, it's the same story. Nothing has changed, but at least I have a few new jokes, and hopefully, for those of you who have not heard the story, I do want you to understand how much Duke means to me. I've had the great fortune to travel the world. I started a company 30 years ago called the Washington Speakers Bureau, and we've represented people like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. We presently represent George Bush and Laura and Condoleezza Rice, Tony Blair, and we sent them all over the world. But when it came time for my personal problems, first person I called was Joe Moore, but I'll get to that in a moment. I did want to share one story. One of the people we represent, you might have heard of. His name is James Carville, okay, the Raging Cajun. And I was in New York a couple weeks ago for the Al Smith dinner, which is this big dinner that takes place annually where politics, business, and the church, Catholic Church, all collide, and they have this massive formal affair. So they reached out to me and said, do you think you could get James Carville and Mary Madeline to come speak at the dinner? So I called them, and they said, sure, we'd be glad to come. So it was an amazing evening, and when I first saw Mary, I couldn't believe. She looked stunning. She had this outfit on I'd never seen before. So they had this enormous dais up on stage at the hotel, at the Waldorf, and Mary got up and spoke for about 15 minutes, very poignant remarks. So James gets up, and it's as only he can say it. Ladies and gentlemen, he says, how about my wife tonight? Doesn't she look good? Honey, stand up. So Mary stands up. He says, I want you all to know that's an Oscar de la Renta. You can sit down, dear. And with that, he opens his jacket and he says, now you see this? This is an Oscar de la Rental. Now, James is one of my favorite people, and early on, when he had signed on, we paired him up with Newt Gingrich. Now, that, if ever there was the odd couple, oh, you've heard of him, okay. Well, James and Newt went out for this engagement that I went to visit, and it's a group of 1,500 bankers, which isn't exactly James' sweet spot. So they were going to do a point-counterpoint, but each got up for 5 minutes to talk about what was on their mind and what they'd be talking about later on. So Newt got up. He was very forthright, very polite, shared with the audience, here's what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm glad to be here with my friend James Carville. And with that, he sits down. Now, Carville, never to be intimidated, he gets up on stage, takes his jacket off, rolls his sleeves up, undoes his tie, and lets loose with the following. Ladies and gentlemen, it's real good to be here today with my good friend Newt Gingrich. My God, this is a learned man. If my mama could see me now. This man's got more degrees than a thermometer. But I want to tell you something. When Newt Gingrich graduated from college, he graduated magna cum laude. Me, on the other hand, I graduated thank the laude. One of our other speakers that we've had the great fortune to work with for many, many years is Colin Powell. When he left as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, our firm was successful in having him come on as the client. And a number of years ago, he was giving a speech in Washington, D.C. And as the speech ended, we were leaving. And instead of going up an elevator like you go out and leave most hotels, there was this big, long escalator. So we're going up the escalator. Now, right in front of General Powell is some guy on a cell phone. And the conversation went something like this. Honey, you're not going to believe this. I just heard Colin Powell speak. He was unbelievable. He was fantastic. Without missing a beat, General Powell taps the guy on the shoulder. Guy turns around and does one of these. Colin says, give me the phone. So he gets the phone. He checks out the guy's name. He says, hey, honey, this is Colin. Tom and I wanted to know what's for dinner. Needless to say, this guy was pretty shocked, okay? Just like the day I was shocked. My cancer journey began actually 22 years ago. My mother noticed a spot on my back. I was walking around the house without a shirt on. She said, I think you should have that looked at. Now, I've never wanted to disappoint my mama, okay? For those of you who have sons who might have disappointed you at some point in your life, I want you to know I've always tried to be a good son. So I followed her advice. I went to a dermatologist. 3 days later, I got a call saying that it was malignant and I needed to have something done immediately. So I went over to a hospital and I had it removed. And then for the next 18 years, I was absolutely fine. So 18 years later, we have this fateful conversation. My mother says, you know, I have an aneurysm in my body, and I don't know if they're hereditary, but I think you should go get checked out. So once again, I did not want to disappoint my mom, so I went and got checked out. And the test results came back, and they said, there's no sign of an aneurysm, but we see something there, we're not quite sure what it is. We're going to run another test next week. So we did a CAT scan with contrast, still couldn't figure it out. So they suggested you ought to go get a biopsy. So I went over to Alexandria Hospital, and I had a biopsy done. And I remember coming out of a haze, and I looked over, and there was my wife. And she was just sobbing uncontrollably. And it was at that point, as Joe mentioned, I learned I had stage 4 metastatic melanoma. And it just threw me for a loop because I felt terrific. I hadn't had any symptoms whatsoever. All right? So this all was a big shock. So I ended up immediately coming down to Duke, where I met with Dr. Jared Golub, who looked at everything, we talked, and the net of the conversation, I will tell you, as a cancer patient, the one thing you want to know is how much time do you have left? And I asked him, and I put the pressure on him. I said, I need to know this, okay? I'm a big boy. I need to know. And he didn't miss a beat. He looked right at me, and he said, based on everything I see, I'd estimate you have 11 months to live, and I think you need to go home and get your financial affairs in order. There's nothing we can do for you. And this really threw me for a loop. I mean, I was not prepared for this, but I did say, I won't accept that. There's got to be something. So at that point, he told me about something called IL-2, interleukin-2. He says, you need to understand, it only works in 15% of the cases. Okay, those are the odds you're looking at. And I said, is that all you got? And he said, that's it. So I went from Duke, I flew down to MD Anderson, where my friend Bob Bast, who's also on the V Foundation board, it's where he worked. And Bob ran me through similar tests, and sure enough, it came back, same diagnosis and the same recommendation, IL-2. So it's at that point I had to make a decision. Where was I going to go? Where was I going to be treated? I had my family, my friends, my whole support network was in Northern Virginia, or do I come down here? And I'm going to tell you something. If it wasn't for Joe Moore, I mean, I don't know what I would have done. But there was never any hesitation. I said, I want to come to Duke. And I asked Dr. Golub when we could get started, and he said right away. So at that point, I flew down to North Carolina, and we got started. And when it comes to IL-2, I'll tell you this, it's not for sissies. And whatever you do, if you don't ever read on the internet about it, because it is just awful. Well, when I went through it, it was pretty bad. But I had great support, the doctors, the nurses, everybody. But the thing that happened for me, and I'm one of the fortunate ones, is that when you go through interleukin, it goes over an 8-month period, and you come in for a week of taking as much interleukin as you can, and then they test you 2 months later just to see, is there progress? Have these tumors shrunk? And unbelievably, what Dr. Golub told me was you had 30 plus tumors. So I don't know what the final number was, but when I did my first test, there was shrinkage. So I went through this, another cycle, came back for testing. It was more shrinkage. Finally, after the last dosage, and I came back for my last exam, Dr. Golub walked in with a sheet of paper, and he says, "You're in remission." So the night before, I'd taken an envelope out. For those of you who follow football, Bill Walsh was a coach who used to coach for the San Francisco 49ers. He used to take out a pad, and he'd write down the first 25 plays that he wanted to run in a particular game just to see what the defense did. I wrote down the names of 25 of my closest friends, including my mom and dad and my girls. And I just said, if I'm successful tomorrow, I'm going to call these 25 people right away. And when I got the word, we immediately went out to the airport, and I got on the telephone, and I called everybody. I shared the news. So my wife and I flew back to Washington, and for those of you who've been to Reagan National Airport, as you walk down the corridor past the security gate, okay, that's where you get the escalators, you go down and you leave the airport. Well, as we were coming through the security on the way out, I noticed in the distance there were all these people standing there, and I guess when I came into view, they all started jumping up and down and hollering and making a fuss. Now, this is 8 o'clock at night, and I said, "Wow, what's going on?" Because my eyes are bad, and I couldn't figure out who that was. As I got there closer, I realized these are all the people I work with. And they'd all come out to the airport to welcome me home, including James Carville. I mean, he's everywhere in my life. I don't know how, but there he is. And I will tell you, it is the most humbling moment of my life to see them there. It was incredible. It made the journey worthwhile. So at that point, I was in great shape. And for 15 months, I was in remission. I'd come down every 3 months for my PET scan. Everything was great, no problems. But then I woke up one morning and I started having stomach pains, and they were really severe. And I came down several times, and I had Joe Moore help me run these tests. And they'd look at it, and they couldn't figure out what the problem was, what was causing it. Is it indeed cancer-related? And so this is an amazing thing. I mean, I took the pill cam. I did everything possible to try to identify what is the problem. So on my last visit, Joe says, "I've got an idea." So he takes the film, and he goes to find Dr. Doug Tyler, okay, the melanoma surgeon, if you will. And Joe Moore comes back in 30 seconds. He says, "Doug Tyler found it." He looked right at the film, saw exactly what it was. You have a small tumor on your small intestine. And with that, it's like, oh, well, I had surgery. So now I've had cancer 3 times. And we have the surgery, I go through recovery, go back home, go to work, I feel fine. So I come down just for a routine checkup. And I'm glad you didn't have to see the look on Joe Moore's face that I did when he walked in and he says, "We found another tumor." And I said, "Is this ever going to stop?" And I talked to Joe, and we got a hold of Doug Tyler and immediately went in for more surgery. And this time they found a tumor in one of my lymph nodes. They removed it. I'm happy to tell you, it's been 2 years and 2 months, but who's counting, okay? It's been 2 years, 2 months since I've been in remission, and I feel just terrific. 2 years ago, I was invited to come down to speak at the Duke Melanoma Forum, and it was a big honor for me to do that. I'd never been invited to speak anywhere. In fact, my parents have been trying to get me to shut up for years. But I came down, but that morning of the speech, I sat in my room over at the Hilton trying to figure out what I was going to say, and something happened. Something very transformative happened to me that morning as I was thinking about my experience and what I'd been through. You remember when I told you when my wife and I came back to Reagan National Airport and we walked through the security line, we saw these people cheering and what have you? I realized that morning as I was working on the speech, those people weren't cheering for me. They were happy to see me. I'm their boss, I'm their friend. Those people were cheering for the doctors and for the nurses and the researchers and the contributors and, yes, the administrators, okay? That's who they were cheering for. Make no mistake about it, okay? It was just, it was a blinding flash of the obvious. So it really enriched my experience, if you will, and my love of this very special place. Last year, I was invited back to speak once again to a different group. And this time, I had the good fortune to listen to all of the plans about the new cancer center. Now, mind you, this presentation that was given by Kevin was fabulous. It talked about what a phenomenal facility it is and the hope it's going to give people. But I would say to you all today that there's something that's very special about this place that I call the spirit of Duke medicine. Okay? It's the spirit that the doctors and nurses bring here every single day. Make no mistake about it, doctors and nurses on a daily basis face a fundamental issue, and that is, how close do I want to get to this patient? Working in cancer is no day at the beach. You lose patients. It happens. But the fact of the matter is, the doctors and nurses who worked on me, every single one of them who came in, gave me their all. Now, I will tell you, as a cancer patient, there is one thing you want to know more than anything else. When that doctor or nurse walks in, you want to know one thing, and that is, do you care about me? As long as you can answer that question, you're going to feel good as a patient. So you can ask any of the doctors and nurses who work with me every single day. If a new doctor or nurse walked in, I literally would reach out of my bed and said, I need to know something. Do you care about me? Because if I know that you care about me, I'm going to do my part, and I'm going to beat this. And so I will just say, I never once saw a doctor or a nurse look at their watch. I never once saw a doctor or nurse say to me, I'm moving on. I got another patient I got to get to, or it's late at night and I got to move on. Every doctor and nurse that worked with me just said to me, what can I do for you? How can I help you? All right? It was just an incredible experience. It's the doctors, it's the nurses, it's everybody. It's a team effort, if ever there is. The last thing I want to share with you involves my 18-year-old daughter. I have two daughters, one's 21, one's 19. Emily, last year, was a first-team high school All-American. By the way, this is a good story. She was a first-team high school All-American at St. Stephen's, St. Agnes School in Alexandria, Virginia, playing lacrosse. And she looked all over the country. She settled on James Madison University. They offered her a partial scholarship to come play lacrosse, and she's been there since September, and she's having the time of her life. It's just amazing what a good time she's having. Last weekend, there was a women's lacrosse tournament at Georgetown. And in addition to James Madison University, Georgetown was there, along with a number of other prominent schools. And I will tell you that in the third game, Emily's out, and she's, as a freshman, she's been able to play a fair amount, and I've been very pleased. And it's right near the end of her third game. She's tired. Somebody got her a pass, and there she was standing in front of the goal. And she shot, and she made it. It was her first intercollegiate goal, okay? It was just a moment that was frozen in time, because if it hadn't been for the people at Duke, I wouldn't have seen that. Now, as Paul Harvey would say, I'll tell you the rest of the story. It happens that the team she scored the goal against was the Lady Blue Devils. You talk about feeling conflicted. Okay, I mean, it was amazing. I will end my remarks simply by saying that I'm not naive to think that my cancer can't come back. Okay? But let me tell you the great story. The great news is that if it does, I'm prepared. But the great thing is, this is what I've got to look forward to. Okay? I will eagerly come down here. Okay? It's something that the nurses and the doctors are very special. And to them, I will end my remarks by simply saying, thank you for caring about me.